being an educator, I find myself frequently depressed about what seems to me to be a change in education. When I went to college, I just went to see what college would have to offer. I would take my classes and get excited about things that I had never heard of before or thought of. And, I developed a love of literature, a love of philosophy. There was all this fascinating stuff out there, right? And it wasn't aimed at, how will this get me a job that will get me promoted, that will get me to, right? It closes off the possibility. It doesn't even suggest to people, well, find something you're passionate about and then develop that. Or it doesn't ask you to be kind of self-exploratory. You think you know what you want and you go for it, and then it's not what you want. And that, I think, can create a crisis of meaning. So what I would like is to be able to turn the public discourse around from that and, kind of encourage people to step back and ask questions about what would make my life worth living earlier in the day and approach their opportunities in that spirit.
Just a quick note, this series that you're about to listen to on Susan Wolf's moral philosophy was recorded in the fall of 2022. That was my first semester of Houston's master's program. That's when this series was recorded. It's not being released until now because, well, grad school got in the way. But it is here. It is still relevant. These things are not going out of date at any time soon. And with that brief introduction, I'll provide the details of the class and all of that in the episode itself. But I hope you really enjoy, as I enjoyed recording, this 6-part series on Susan Wolf's moral philosophy. Okay, well, we're starting a new series, this time conjoined with a class that I'm taking, not actually at the University of Houston. This is a class that I'm taking at Rice. So we're going to be kind of, I guess, reading along, for lack of a better word. So I'll be double dipping, doing podcast duties and school duties with this. So the class that I'm taking this semester is called Freedom, Value, and Love. And like I said, it's at Rice, which makes it a PhD program class conjoined with Houston's MA program. And it's taught, I didn't tell you this, Giffen. So it's taught by 2 professors, actually, which is kind of interesting. Sam Reese Dennis and Vita Yao, both at Rice. So it's a class that basically goes through the main themes of Susan Wolf's work. Adam and I are huge fans of Wolf. Giffen, we'll find out how much of a fan you are over the course of this series.
We will.
But yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Would you guys so I mean that's really all I have to say by way of introduction. So we're going to be just like going over basically the main themes of Susan Wolf's work. We'll be going through like a bunch of essays of hers on freedom, value, and love, as the title implies. I don't know, is there anything more to say about it really? I don't think so.
I mean, just like as like a general introduction for the paper. I mean, I guess just like as a small point, I mean, you said this was like her first major paper, and she still wrote this one when she was with the University of Maryland, right?
That sounds correct. So this,
there was University of Maryland at the signature of the version I printed, which may not be the same one as yours.
Yeah, no, it's not. And from the next episode onward, it will be. So I'm actually reading. So she has this collected volume, The Variety of Values. I love the cover also. But yeah, so it's a collected volume of hers with like various essays. And that's what I'll be reading from. But yeah, I think Moral Saints was published in 1987 and 1982. Oh, okay.
Wow. I didn't even realize that.
Yeah.
And I think it's true to say you could disagree with everything Susan Wolf has to say, but still find immense value in her papers on the force of her writing alone. Like even if you think every point she makes is bunk and she makes it for the wrong reasons, which I don't, I still think it's a rare pleasure of academic philosophy to read her work.
Definitely. I mean, it was beautifully written.
Yeah, it was very well written.
Yes.
It was very circular in nature too, in the sense that like, I mean, she really ties in, her major points in at the end, to how she starts the paper. So like, by the time you hit like page 19, she totally ties it back around. So
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Okay, so I guess we can sort of talk about it in any way we want to. It's been a little while since we've done a podcast, but I mean, so first of all, I'll put my cards on the table. I both like reread this paper earlier today and then had the 2.5 hour seminar on it. So I am kind of, I'm at my fill almost of talking about, this paper in particular for the day. So I may be a little bit scatterbrained when it comes to the overall thrust of the paper, but I take her main point to be that basically she's investigating the goal of morality itself. So she's asking, like, when we're talking about moral systems, she's raising the question of like, okay, what is a moral system for? What does it mean to aspire to a moral aim? Like, what are the things, that we should be aiming for? She's not like, I think there's a way to read this and come away thinking like, oh, this was a devastating critique of like utilitarianism. And that's not what this is, in my view, at least. This is much more of using, utilitarianism or Kantianism as a foil to then kind of like put forth her own view on morality. Does that square with how you guys read it?
yeah, that is kind of how I read it. And it's like, it's also like like a moral framework isn't the only framework, through which to view like kind of life's meaning, or how, meaning in one's life. So, and if one attempts to kind of like derive meaning entirely from one's moral framework, then one is missing out on a lot of other values and potential, I don't know, I guess like achievements that one could have, like at least personality wise, character wise.
Yeah, I think she would say that there's a certain poverty to the life of a moral saint, right?
Yeah.
I think that the first three sentences of this paper I would nominate for the best 3 sentences of any paper ever written. Like so she opens the paper by saying, I don't know whether there are any moral saints, but if there are, I am glad that neither I nor those about whom I care most are among them. By moral saint, I mean a person whose every action is as morally good as possible, a person that is who is as morally worthy as can be. So, I mean, that first of all is a great way to open the paper, but
it's very effective.
It's so effective. She introduces the like core concept, not the core concept, but a core concept of the paper in an incredibly brief, straightforward way, which is like pretty fucking rare for philosophy papers.
And frankly, for me, it immediately made me kind of contemplate this, because I don't have much of a background in like moral philosophy. So it immediately kind of set me in a proper frame of mind for like the remaining 20 pages.
Oh, there was, okay. Oh, so this was caught by someone in class that was actually really interesting. And I did not pick up on this, but you could accuse her of a minor conflation in the 3rd sentence already, because so she says, by moral saint, I mean a person whose every action is as morally good as possible. That's one concept, like someone whose every action is as morally good as possible. But then she also adds, comma, a person that is who is as morally worthy as can be, which is, it's not a big deal. They're very, very connected, moral worth and moral, doing the action that produces the most good. But they are a little bit different in the sense that like the ascription of moral worth to someone implies certain things that just producing moral goodness doesn't. So like I kind of read that as, so I described it as a conflation, or she could be also just specifying the concept she's talking about more and saying like, okay, not only does this person create the most moral good that they possibly can, they do it intentionally like with that as the aim, thus, having the most moral worth. Does that seem like a plausible reading of that to you guys?
It does. I definitely didn't read it that way. I just kind of read it as like,
Almost like the same. Yeah.
It's almost like, okay, they've acted as morally as they could, within like a certain framework. So they've achieved like the highest moral worth within that framework.
I can imagine if there's like a body of literature which kind of clarifies the concepts, that it could be a little bit jarring that she kind of just like assumes an equivalency. But for like intuitively just kind of reading it casually, like I was like morally good as possible, moral worth. I was like, yeah, okay, that follows.
Yeah, because it's like, there's like, as you both know, there's sort of also concept of like praiseworthiness or blameworthiness in the responsibility debate. And those can be different than the effects that they produce.
That's true.
Yeah.
But I'm going to choose to read that as more of a clarification. Like, you can't be a moral saint by accident, in other words.
Yeah, I think that's a fair reading. That's what I assumed going through the first time.
Yeah. So maybe I'll read a few other kind of like tabling quotes. She says, in other words, I believe that moral perfection, in the sense of moral saintliness, does not constitute a model of personal well-being towards which it would be particularly rational or good or desirable for a human being to strive. So, this kind of introduces like a bit of a tension. And she says, it is generally assumed that one ought to be as morally good as possible, and that what limits there are to morality's hold on us are set by features of human nature, which we ought not to be proud. So she's kind of saying, like, it's generally assumed that, there are these like extremely strong moral imperatives, and the fact that we can't reach them, we can't do the most good possible in every circumstance, is like a shortcoming of ours. Yeah. She's going to resist that conclusion and argue that, quote, we must change our conception of what is involved in affirming a moral theory, which is, like I said in the beginning, it's actually really interesting. I take her point to be in this paper, like she's not talking about the content of any moral theory. Rather, it's the idea that, like, if you ascribe to a moral theory to tell you, like, if you think that a moral theory populates the answer to everything, every question of like should or ought, then you are missing something grave in life. I
was just kind of curious. So this would have been a while ago, I'm guessing, for you, Jordan, but do you remember how that like kind of rubbed against or with your intuitions the first time you read this? Like just that kind of claim, because she goes kind of out of the gate here. And I think is assuming she's going to be like butting up against like some intuition, right? That's kind of the framing. So I'm just not sure if like to what extent you felt that as well.
I was actually talking with Sam in his office hours today before this. Okay, so this is the first time that I've read this paper like cover to cover. I had read excerpts of it. I have like read quotes from it in other readings, right? But this is the first time I've like sat down and read this paper. So I knew kind of like the thrust of her argument. But I would say that in like the beginning of my philosophy classes in college, I was much more, and I still am to some degree, and like I don't know to what degree I am like really holding to this. I think the next couple weeks readings will push me in one direction or another. But like I started off initially with the position of saying, yes, like these moral imperatives are extreme, they are demanding, and they are inescapable. Like I can't find a good objection to, like, do you know Peter Singer's shallow pond argument?
Sounds familiar.
Yes.
So like I'll gloss it real quick. It's basically like you would be a monster if you stepped over a drowning child in a shallow pond because you didn't want to ruin your shoes, right? Like you'd be a monster.
Yeah.
It's the same fucking thing on a world scale. Like you have the ability to donate to Oxfam the $300 that you will use to buy a new suit. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's just so like, for things like that, for instance, like I just don't have a good response to that. Like I think he's right. And I also think that, I know that I'm not going to do that. So how do I square that? Well, I've always just said, like, humans fall short of the demands of morality. Like I did exactly what Wolf is pushing back against.
Okay.
Like,
That was really what I was curious about, because
Yeah.
I had kind of the same framework exactly. It's like it can be squared, like you said, just people can be louses, so everything's consistent in that framework. But it was very interesting. Even just the first page alone, I just really was curious what your initial impressions were. Adam, yours as well. I'm curious if you were kind of with us.
I mean, whenever I read this, I was definitely I wasn't, I guess, like holding any opinion. I was kind of waiting for her to like define for me like what a moral saint would look like. Like I wanted to actually kind of begin to kind of judge whatever she kind of depicted first. You know what I mean? Like make sure we're on the same page for what she means by moral saintliness. Like, and like it when she
the intuition though, how did that feel? Like I know, like I was also waiting the entire time just to like for more clarifications and such, but how did the intuition on the first page? I'm just curious.
I don't know. It kind of made kind of sense to me, to be honest with you. Maybe that's because I knew this paper was supposed to be good before reading it, but I don't know. It kind of made sense to me. I'm just like a moral saint. I'm like, is that the, only way to judge somebody? You know what I mean? Like, so, through like the lens of some sort of moral framework. So I was kind of like, I guess, probably primed to have that opinion, but I certainly kind of came in with that opinion like by the end of page 1. So
okay, that's fair. I was just curious. That was like one of the biggest things I wanted to ask about.
What did you guys think of we just talked about like the kind of the introduction section, but the section after that is called Moral Saints and Common Sense. I mean, this section was extremely funny. Also, like besides being insightful, I found her descriptions of, she was kind of mocking the two types of saints almost. Like I found that very, very funny. I guess we should explain the two types of saints that there are. So there's the loving saint and the rational saint. And so they're both types of moral saints in that, they conform to her definition, right? They produce the most moral good that they possibly can. And they're as morally worthy as they can be, right? So, I'll just like table them both, and then I'm curious if you guys had any thoughts about the two types of saints. But okay, so the loving saint is someone who, I'll just read a little bit of Wolf here. So she says, a moral saint that might be someone whose concern for others plays the role that is played in most of our lives by more selfish, or at any rate, less morally worthy concerns. For the moral saint, the promotion of the welfare of others might play the role that is played for most of us by the enjoyment of material comforts, the opportunity to engage in intellectual and physical activities of our choice, and the love, respect, and companionship of people whom we love, respect, and enjoy. So that's just a way of saying basically like the loving saint maximizes moral outcomes because that's what they want to do. Like that's kind of what I thought that was kind of like hard to like I mean it's straightforward, but like it's hard to grasp like the mental state. It's like someone's bioengineered to like the entire incentive structure internally is warped. Like the joy you get like eating ice cream is like that's what I get for like sacrificing my like time and money and energy towards helping people, like that, like positive incentive, very interesting, but it seemed like the less probable option.
Do we think there's anything, I guess, like disturbing or problematic, per se about being like a loving saint?
That's what I was getting at.
Because I think the rational saint, okay, like that's a completely different discussion, but like let's just focus on the loving saint here. I mean, this is like, like the values of this individual are in complete alignment with like moral aims, right?
Yeah.
And it's a completely fulfilling thing for that person too. So,
and I think also because of the way she set up the problem, she's also defined the fact that like the loving saint, because they're motivated by what they want to do and they always maximize the good, that is also saying that like they don't have any other projects. They don't have like these other She even says at one point, I don't remember the page, but like for the loving saint, any well, this is for both kind of saints, but it applies to the loving saint. Like any non-moral skills or kind of or maybe even just like material goods you might come into are only good instrumentally to produce good. So like if you have like a patient character or whatever, or you have the skill of, like, she has the example of, you know, if you're really good at golf, that might only be incidentally good if it secures a donation from Oxfam or something, right?
Right.
Yeah. So like I like the loving saint. I mean, to answer your question, Adam, like the loving saint sounds deathly boring to me. Like I was like laughing at her description of these people where, you know, she says like, you know, she says, you know, for example, a cynical or sarcastic wit or a sense of humor that appreciates this kind of wit in others requires that one take an attitude of resignation and pessimism towards the flaws and vices to be found in the world. And like, I mean, honestly, this just made me think of our sense of humor. Like, you know, like
I agree with that. I mean, I'm not sure we would like enjoy that type of person, but certainly nothing in that description kind of like disturbed me. You know what I mean? And it's not something we can like. That wouldn't be something like we would, you know, pursue as the ideal, because you know, if anything, we would all pursue, you know, being rational saints, right? Because that's not.
We just don't.
You can't really. You can't pursue. You either are or not like a loving saint, and no one is a loving saint. Like that is a bioengineered creature at that point. That's how I conceptualize.
I agree with that. I agree with that. Like,
there's never lived a loving saint in perfection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But like, if there was, like, I don't see that as like a disturbing thing that someone was, you know.
I don't know. It would make me aware of like the fact that like every single like incentive structure in their mind is all geared towards, you know, this one thing. It would be kind of like curious to me. I don't know if disturbing is necessarily appropriate term, but it would be kind of jarring in a way that the second saint is not.
So there's like, okay, there's three different questions that Adam's question could be split into, right? Here's the first question. Would you opt yourself into becoming a loving saint if you could? That's the first question. The second question is, can we say it's bad for the world if there is like a loving moral saint? And then the third possible question is, can we say it's bad for that person to be a loving saint? So like, I think the answer to the second question is really obvious. It's like, it's really good for the world if Giffen, you transform into a loving saint tomorrow, right? Like it would be a loss to Adam and I and other people in your life, presumably.
But no, I think that's fair. These are interesting questions. Yeah.
And like, because I also think the answer to the first question, we're probably going to agree, because the fact that we're not moral saints means that we would resist becoming one.
Yeah, right. It's a value kind of thing.
Yeah. And like, you know, I didn't think of that question for class. It would have been an interesting one to like bring up, but like and Wolf would probably say, yeah, like there's something to the fact that you would not opt into becoming a loving saint if you could.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's a very interesting version of a vampire problem.
Yeah. And it's,
do you become like the best version of yourself? Or well, Wolf would critique that, but because what from one framework could be considered.
Because I would opt into, if you were like, would you wave a magic wand and become the best version of yourself? Yeah, like
but it's not equivalent, and that's kind of the entire point.
That's actually like one of the entire points of her paper.
Yeah, that's the perfectionist view, right?
Yes,
as opposed to the purely, you know, moralist view here.
The individual perfectionist view. Like personal excellence.
I think no, I wouldn't want to become that person, because I kind of like, you know, assess my own you know, I guess my own life's meaning through like a variety of different,
at least one non-moral framework.
Yeah. But I don't think that's bad for that person though, if they did.
That's interesting. See, I think Wolf is pretty clear that the answer would be yes.
Wait, being that person or transforming into that person? I'm sorry, I lost the
it's being, like being that person. Yeah.
So Adam was answering like to my third question. can we say it's bad for the loving saint to be a loving saint?
To be like basically born in this case. I don't know. I mean, if that person is, well, I guess there's kind of a
because my intuition is no. Like I don't see anything wrong with it. I mean, like it's like I think you'd have to appeal to like non-moral grounds, which like they wouldn't value anyway. So like,
well, I think we so I don't know that it depends on what they value. Like I was kind of saying, could we as like a rational third party kind of like look at them and say this condition that they have is bad for them, even if they themselves wouldn't say it, in the same way that you might say it for someone who's, has Alzheimer's or something, right?
Yeah.
Like,
are we okay, I guess like the Alzheimer's like analogy would be something like this is like, okay, so they have Alzheimer's and
they don't understand that it's bad for them, but we from like a third party perspective can say like it would be better.
But that's not perfectly analogous though, because like the loving saint is someone where like their desires and like their values and their aims are all in alignment, right?
Yeah.
Like so for like the Alzheimer's individual, it would be like they're in this like disordered mental state, but in that state it's like aligned that they wish to like act like this and they do act like that. And it's like, I mean, I don't know.
I mean, this person clearly like would experience like some joy, right? And like other, emotional states that you might value from at least some framework. So it's pretty difficult to evaluate, but I think a little bit, it depends on whether you agree with some of Wolf's, I want to call them assumptions about like how they would be interpersonally. Because if you kind of just like have in the back of your mind when answering this question, like, oh, they would have like basically incapable of having a sense of humor, then I think it may be fair to say like they're missing out on something. But if you think it's not necessarily like required for a moral saint to like be lacking those things, right? It just may be just like, they're experiencing very similar things as we are, just all of their actions are oriented towards moral good, all of them. Right.
It's okay, so like here's a question. If like let's say that there was someone who had a singular value in exactly the same way, but it was just sort of like a random value, like an amoral one, like this person was obsessed with and they just spent their life getting better at loving every minute of it, just perfecting like the craft of making like Gouda cheese or something, right? Like super random. Like I feel the very strong pull to say, yeah, that person's like missing something. Like if we could grant that person the ability to also enjoy other things, like that would be good for them, right? So
that's true.
But what I'm wondering here is like, okay, why do I think that? Is it because the singularity of their value system is what's wrong, or is it because what they value is wrong? Right?
No, that's true. I think it implies, and we probably all feel similarly, I'm guessing, but it would imply that we have a value of having multiple, right? It's our value. That's singularity is just a little bit, I guess it rubs the intuition the wrong way.
Yeah, because it just seems like, I mean, like reading this line here, like for the moral saints, the promotion of the welfare of others might play the role that is played for most of us by the enjoyment of material comforts, the opportunity to engage in the intellectual and physical activities of our choice, and the love, respect, and companionship of people whom we love, respect, and enjoy.
Yeah, well, it's a big might there. Like, it might play the role.
Well, I think that she's saying like almost imagine if it did. You know what I mean? She's saying it's not like might, it's this thing might play the role of the, you know what I mean? I think I read it with that inflection.
That's true. I guess I was just kind of curious if that was like a requirement.
Because if it doesn't, then yeah.
Then who cares? Yeah.
I'm like if it doesn't play the role of those
just
things,
pretend she said does instead of might. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think more on that, but it doesn't seem obvious to me that
Yeah.
I would say that being in that condition is like bad for that person. So
Yeah, because like this we almost had this a similar kind of conversation when we were discussing Frankfurt's paper on the second order desires. When remember we were asking ourselves like, are there desires that you would willingly remove if you could? And we all said yes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like I'm thinking about that in this context where I would remove some desires that I have, not because I think they're bad for me, but because I'm actually just, it would simplify life in many ways if I actually had fewer desires, even if some of those desires are good for me. So like, let me just, try to think of an example. Like, there's some, okay, like I can find it pleasurable in some like very, very small sense to, damn, what's like a good example? Like, okay, just to take care of a house plant, right?
or what if you have zero desire for wealth? I mean,
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
like truly zero desire.
Well, I was trying to make it something really trivial in that, so I'm not saying like the idea, like, like taking care of houseplants is something that I could get better at, right? Like I could learn more about it or whatever. And I would willingly forego that desire, not because I think it's bad for me at all, right? But because I think life would be simpler if I just didn't even have these like flash up desires here and there that I don't want to actually pursue. Like, I think it would be, I think I'd be way happier to be just better, like way better at fewer things. Right.
Yeah.
But I don't think that I would ever, but that list would never get down to one thing of anything. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess the question for me comes down to like, is the life of having multiple pleasures in some way like robustly better than the life of the loving saint who only has like one type of pleasure? And like, I do want to say yes in some non-trivial sense, but it's just an intuition.
Yeah, exactly. It's like
just,
it is absolutely intuitive that that's the case for me. Like I just observing my own kind of reactions. But can I like say anything else about it? Like, not really.
Yeah, which ends up not being that great of a problem for Wolf. Like, yeah. Okay, so the rational saint. Do we want to talk about that?
Sure.
So the rational saint is kind of the other side of the coin from the loving saint. This is someone very much like ourselves who does not intrinsically kind of derive this, wonderful pleasure from doing good works. But they do it out of duty. So they think that, maximizing good in whatever way, I shouldn't even say maximizing good, adhering perfectly to whatever moral theory you think is correct is the right thing to do for this person. And so they do it not because they enjoy doing it, but because it is the right thing to do. So Giffen already mentioned that like the rational saint is what's on offer for people like us. And so it's kind of the only live option realistically.
Yeah, I can at least conceptualize this person a little bit easier.
I mean, yeah, the thing is we have the ability to become this person tonight. Like if we wanted to, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
we don't.
And we don't. And,
night after night.
Yeah. Monsters. What do you think about so the questions that we just asked, what do we think about that for a rational saint? I think it's way easy. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, Jordan, please, you go first.
I'm just, so I think the answer to the most interesting question, the one we kind of disagreed about a little bit, the third one, is much easier for me to answer for the rational saint. Like, it's just no. That it is just like way worse for this person.
I wrote down one word and it was tragic.
Yeah. This would actually be,
this person's like suffering, like basically.
Yeah. And it would be like, I mean, it's just, okay, it would annoy the hell out of everyone around you, but it would also be just like bad for this person too. So there's just a quote from Wolf. She says, A moral saint will have to be very, very nice. It is important that he not be offensive. The worry is that as a result, he will have to be dull-witted or humorless or bland. And it's like,
This is like, I imagine this when I wrote a quick note, but it was like, this is how kind of like what it is to like target the least common denominator, like an advertisement or something like that.
Yes,
It's like you just have to like, you cannot be
yes.
offensive. So you're just so like bland and stale.
And like I think we all know people who are not rational saints, but they skew in that direction. And sometimes you just want to like grab this person by the shoulders and be like, it's okay to have like a dirty sense of humor or like find this fucked up thing not offensive, funny. You know what I mean? Just like it's like
Yeah.
it's like just like it's okay to just like chill out a little bit.
Yeah, I was trying to imagine what it would be like in a society with only one or the other of the saints types. Like only loving saints, like everyone actually would probably, assuming that they are like able to like effectively, do the requirements, every action is morally good as possible. They would, I don't know that it's obvious that anyone would be suffering there if everyone was a loving saint. But for the tragic saint, I think everyone's just suffering.
The rational saint.
There is no like yeah, I'm sorry, yeah.
The tragic saint.
So I literally wrote down the word tragic there, so I
Yeah.
was just reading it. But yeah, like I don't know. I think everyone in there is just like knowing that there are other options available, but like putting all of those emotions and everything aside and just going through day by day. Like those are different worlds.
Yeah. I mean, they're
I
definitely.
think either way, it's like, I mean, it's pretty bad to be like the rational saint. I think we all agree. I do think though that like from like the utilitarian point of view, like taking that moral framework or ethical framework to like I guess like to its ideal, it solves some of those issues, right? Like you wouldn't have to be like purely inoffensive because if you were as bland as possible, that might actually not lead to the greatest happiness among individuals. You know what I mean? Like I'm not saying it doesn't solve it, but it rounds out some of those rougher edges to it a little bit. So
I had the same thought.
Yeah.
Like,
You would
do
be
you-
just like
how-
maximizing every balance between being like
Yeah.
offensive and funny or whatever. Yeah.
exactly, it would be like, okay, you would try to strike that balance exactly. So
Yeah. Okay, so this was not in the text, but this was actually something that Vita talked about, which I was not familiar with this phrase. It's a Latin phrase, de dicto or de re. Have you guys heard of these phrases? I had not.
no.
Okay, so this actually kind of
It
illuminates.
does sound familiar actually, but go ahead.
Okay,
I don't know the context.
so like you can sort of like do an act de dicto or de re of something else. So basically, like if you do an act de dicto, you would say, okay, so like you find a wallet, right, and you look up the number of who owned it, you can return it, right? If you do that act de dicto, you would be returning the wallet because it's the right thing to do. But if you do that act de re, you would be returning the wallet because, this person would be sad if he didn't have his wallet returned, and you don't want to make him sad. So you return it. So I was thinking like, okay, so like think about this in terms of like the rational saint in everyday life. So, okay, the moral saint has a wife, say, right? And the wife is upset. So you buy her flowers, right? And she's kind of like having a rough day or whatever, so you buy her flowers, and she's like, "Oh, that was so sweet of you." And you turn and you say, "Yeah, I bought you flowers because it was the right thing to do." Or because morality demanded it, right? Like it improved your utility.
I literally could not do anything else.
Yeah, okay. Do you guys catch the intuition that like there's something that hollows out the act immediately upon hearing that was the motivation?
Yes, I agree with that.
Especially the latter framing.
Yeah,
I had moral demands
yeah, like the
thrust upon me.
Yeah, but it's like, okay, like you bought me flowers. Oh, that's so sweet of you. Like, yeah, of course. I was feeling bad that you're having a rough day. I wanted to put like a smile on your face. No hollowness there.
Yeah, it sounds like similar reasoning to our discussions about like free will. and freedom of action. Honestly, in the same kind of like intuition as to why it sounds hollowing.
Yeah. In what sense?
It's kind of like, well, like there is one framework in front of me and I follow the framework, you know, like I couldn't do otherwise. Like I act perfectly.
So,
it all comes down to motivation. It's just like, you know, like what motivated you to do this? And it's like, you know, adhering to some moral theory as opposed to like,
I care about you.
Yeah, I guess like a more just like human perspective on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be like, you know, it was so nice of you that you did that, and then you just lay out all the causes that that you know fell out of the sky to make you do it, versus just the local, like, you know, the local explanation of I wanted to do this.
Yeah.
No, I agree. That makes sense. Okay, so let me take a look. These were actually really interesting sort of discussion questions that we did not really get to in class, but I wanted to float them here because I thought they were really good questions. Okay, so the one question that was asked is, can we develop a psychologically plausible or attractive account of being a moral saint? So like, is there an account of being a moral saint? Now, so again, I don't think it necessarily matters like what the content of the moral theory is. So it doesn't matter if you're an Aristotelian, a Nietzschean, a Kantian, a utilitarian, an expressivist, whatever, right? That doesn't matter. But is there a way in which can we paint a picture of a moral saint that you would opt into being?
Yeah. So a lot of like what Wolf is focusing on here is kind of like the de-individualization that occurs through this.
Yeah.
And I think this is kind of just like pure intuition. And she's sort of like tangentially addressed. Well, actually, I think she does sort of address this. But like, if you can somehow like incorporate into like the moral concerns of the person a self-interest, you know, it's like, if you imagine that like my own, you know, if you imagine the case of like the rational saint, for example, like he just like can't spare anything because of the trade-off for like individual like pursuits, like quote unquote like non-moral. But if somehow like there was incorporated in that system, like we value in humans some sort of like what otherwise would be non-moral concerns or interests or personal identity and things like that, then it would be easier to sign on to.
So when you say like incorporate, do you mean in what sense? Like, are those things permissible of you, or are they like, are you like, would your moral theory say like you're required to, you know, maximize self-interest in some way?
It would be more like placing value on it, but not necessarily maximizing, right? Like if you're trying to, this is like a really simple framework, but if you're kind of like a consequentialist of some bend and you're like, well, I value with, you know, imagine just like an equation or something, like, you know, all of like these kind of worldly concerns and, you know, health care concerns and things like that, but also like how much is individuality being expressed. If that was like somewhere in the equation, it would be easier for me to like sign on to.
It's kind of similar to, I mean, it's not exactly this, but like she did mention like later in the paper, just sort of like almost like a hybrid Kantian perspective where there is like this artificial cap to, you know, how moral one is obliged to be.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So maybe something like that, even though it's artificial and really can't be substantiated, because she makes the good point, which is like, okay, you know, if somebody perhaps, you know, gives up, say, 20% of self-interest and just, you know, devotes oneself, you know, 20% to the general happiness of others. I know that's not, you know, Kantian, but still. She brings up the point like, okay, what about someone who devotes their entire lives? Like, are you saying they're not more moral? And it's like, well, they probably are more moral. You know what I mean? So it's like, but maybe something akin to that, if there was some sort of set, I guess, like obligation for like moral sainthood rather than just like your entire being. I don't know.
So you're saying like a checklist almost, like if you meet these checklists, like that's all that really like morality can ask of you.
Yeah, like that became like part of my personality, right? Like I just like became that person all of a sudden where it's like 20% of me, you know, of my interests, you know, was perfectly aligned with like, you know, let's just say like altruism, just like, you know, generally raising like the well-being of people. Like, like, oh, okay, well, maybe something like that. You know what I mean? But I wouldn't be a saint at that point.
I was going to say,
no, I wouldn't be a saint, but it just, I don't know.
So
I don't know. I was just floating that idea.
I think that's interesting. So I'm going to just kind of reframe what I was saying earlier a bit, because like this is how I was internalizing it. This is more of an economic framework I'm bringing in. But at a certain point, there are diminishing returns to strict adherence to like a non-individual concerned moral framework, such that like at a certain point, like the loss of like your own individuality is actually a greater loss to whatever good is being done in that like marginal time. So that's I don't know if that clarifies it a bit.
So the problem with that is that does seem to just like, if maybe I misunderstood you, but like that seems to just lapse back into just like utility maximization. You're just saying like it comes out differently, right? Like
I think that's fair, but I think like Wolf was, maybe I misread. But it seemed like Wolf was saying like that kind of doesn't necessarily come into play. And I'm saying like I think I would, if that's like her claim, like the difference that would allow me to be more willing to sign on would be if it was.
So if I'm understanding you right, you're saying like if the utility worked out such that you retaining certain things about you now, like like you derived so much pleasure from those that it did work out in the end, that was the right thing to do, right?
Yeah, not necessarily like me in particular, but
people in general.
Yes.
See,
some individuality, I guess, is kind of like how I've been imagining it. Yeah. There could be other things in place of the word individuality, but
I don't think that counts, because if you think about the counterfactual, what if that wasn't the case? Then you would have other duties if you were a moral saint. So I don't think that really counts. Like that's almost like signing up for a moral saint by contingencies of accident, right? Like because it happens to work out this way. But if you really did like solely adhere to what like the duty of morality required, and it turned out differently, you would do differently, Wolf has that phrase about, springing to the moral duty at the drop of a hat. Mm-hmm. It's like as soon as you, like if you're a moral saint, like of either kind, as soon as you realize what the right thing to do is, you just do it, either out of duty or because it's the right thing to do. You know what I mean?
To assess that question, like I don't know Nietzschean moral theory. What is that?
I don't understand. I've never taken a class on it in particular, so I can give you a gloss of it. So basically, we talked about this with Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where Nietzsche thinks that it's actually kind of Sartrean, actually, where like life is like the creation of values. Remember how Sartre talked about like you have to kind of invent yourself as you live or whatever. It's kind of the same. It's kind of the same thing with Nietzsche in a lot of ways, where he thinks that like all of these either contemporary or historical ideologies are like false, and many of them were like put up in the first place to kind of like keep you subservient. He says like Christianity, he attacks it as being slave morality. So he has like the creation of your own values, like being the Übermensch. And I wonder if that is actually kind of the closest way you can come to like.
It sounds like it.
I was gonna say, yeah.
I mean, you're not adhering to some strict framework, but rather sort of ultimately what you think is right. I mean, so
And if
like,
if you think it's like, and if you think that that's the right thing to do, you're just
You do it.
maximizing that. Yeah,
you do it. Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting one, at least. I mean, if that's like the, you know, the moral framework there, but
yeah. And the problem is, like, Wolf kind of just mentions it in passing. Like, I don't know what she would say to that. That's definitely like the closest you could come, in my opinion. Okay, so yeah, I mean, fuck it, we can talk about this right now. In office hours before, I had this really interesting and or wait, no, let's skip past that. Okay, so I actually had this really interesting and challenging conversation with Sam in the office hours before this, and he definitely put me on my back foot in a way that I was not expecting, in a really good way. And he did tell me that, like, so the subsequent readings will be about some of this stuff in meta ethics. And this kind of is, it's getting to like what Wolf starts to kind of talk about more in the second half of the article. So we were talking, and because in my reading response, like, I raised the question of like, well, in the past, I've had very much the view of saying, like, well, biting the bullet in some sense, and saying, like, I do believe that consequentialism broadly defined is true, right? So, like, all of the things that put us in a generally positive direction psychologically, how it affects consciousness is good. And things that affect consciousness in a negative way, generally speaking, are bad, right? Like, and I just don't know how you escape that. And because of that, like, I think that, like, that's the moral system I adhere to. And whenever we fall flat of that, like, I'm really tempted to, like I said in the beginning, just like raise my hands and say, like, well, we're imperfect. Like, do the thing that Wolf resists. And so he said, okay, but like, you're kind of jumping a gap there without realizing it. I was like, what do you mean, what gap? And he was like, okay, well, like, okay, so I described like the content of a moral theory, right? So for consequentialism, it says that maximizing good consequences, however you define them, is the right thing to do, right? Kant, it's following his categorical imperative, right? Treating someone always as a means, never as an end, or acting upon that maxim, which you can will at the same time to be a universal law, right? Or if you're an Aristotelian, acting in a virtuous way and cultivating a virtuous character, never deviating from like the mean virtue, right? Or if you're, a Nietzschean, becoming the Übermensch, right? So that's the content of the moral theory. But he said, okay, so you told me this content of a moral theory, broadly consequentialist is what you're drawn to. And I was like, yeah. And he says, okay, but like, so you're talking to me, you tell me this is your theory, and I say, well, why should I care? Right? And I'm like, well, I mean, how can you like possibly care about anything that doesn't affect consciousness? Like, how on earth can you possibly like escape that consequentialist maneuver? And he's like, well, yeah, but like, okay, say you tell me like this thing affects, consciousness in a slightly positive or slightly negative way. And I say, okay, but like, why should I care about that? Like, I want to do something else. Like, what, like, you haven't told me why I'm supposed to care about that. And I mean, it's like, and I'm kind of like, still, I don't know really what I think about that response. And
isn't it sort of like just like a bedrock sort of thing though? Where it's like you either care or you don't. I mean, I hate to give that response, but isn't that kind of true? Where it's like, why do we care about like, the well-being of others?
Yeah,
and
we won't find a deep meaning, that God demands or anything.
Yeah, it's like why should I care about the well-being of others? And it's like you don't have to.
No,
but
you don't.
but for most people, like, you do. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, and it's like, and I obviously this is nowhere near where the conversation should go. but like obviously there are evolutionary, reasons why we do care, right? So, and that could be arbitrary, but it's not, because we're social species. But the fact that we value that is like a bit arbitrary, right? But the fact is we also do, so it's like, I don't know.
I was editing the existentialism episodes, and you made me think about that. Remember I shared that one quote by the evolutionary psychologist about the makeup thing? You remember that? He was like, we should teach young boys how to evaluate like how long it took like women to put makeup on, and we were just like, what an underground man, like kind of thing to say. you remember that?
I do recall that video.
Yeah. I'm sorry, it just made me think of that.
But isn't that sort of true though? Like we just do.
Yeah,
like,
so it is, and because I was kind of like saying the same thing. I was like, well, yeah, but just like I just think that those people who say they don't care about that are just wrong. Like they're just they like A, they do care about that. B, they should. Like that's just as simple as it is. Like you do have to take some sort of a leap of faith.
I know Sam Harris is no great philosopher, but I do think like he's got a pretty good point when it comes to this, and where it's just like they're really not part of the moral conversation. You know what I mean? Like if you're somebody that doesn't care about like the consciousness or the conscious experience of like other conscious creatures,
yes,
it's like, well, maybe you're not part of the moral discussion. Like maybe
or
you're
even
not
the moral community.
Moral community.
Yes.
But maybe you're not. You know what I mean? So
or even things that could,
most
like,
do.
Potentially. Yeah,
because most people do care. Like, and it's like, why should you care? It's an interesting question, but like the fact is, you do. You know what I mean? Like, so I don't know.
So I responded with that, and I still think that to a large extent, right? But then he like kind of like moved to Wolf's point, and remember, like one of the things she's asking here is like, what do we even like want our moral theories to be? Like what can we like aspire to in the moral domain, right? And so like, okay, I'll play this game with you guys. Okay, so like so pretend you're a TA, in grad school or whatever, and some undergrad comes to you and they're like, hey, I'm thinking like right now I'm like an English major. I love literature. I'm just like, enjoying this or whatever. But I've been convinced by the effective altruist movement, right? And so I think that like maximizing utility is the right thing to do. So instead, I'm going to switch and become a finance major. I'm going to go into corporate banking. I know I'm going to hate it, but I'll be able to make like $500,000. And I'm just gonna like live in a shit apartment in a bad area of town and just like donate all the money or whatever. And I'm gonna forego like, say he married young or whatever. Like he has a wife, she's not into that game plan or whatever, and so she's gonna divorce him and he's gonna like lose his family or whatever. And he's like, "Do you think that this is advisable? Like, do you think this is something I should do?"
No.
Giffen?
I'm pretty certain it's a no.
Yeah, of course I would say no. Like, don't do that. Okay, so then there's this tension that we all, I think, just kind of like admitted to, right? Where we think that in some sense, like that would be the morally right thing to do. And at the same time, we're not advising that like ourselves or people do it, right? Like we're not advising that to become the rational saint.
Yeah.
So, okay, like the question then kind of gets opened to, and this is something that I'm not sure about, but in a way that I feel like I was more sure coming into reading this paper and like talking with Sam. So like, okay, if you're adhering to a moral theory, and you think it's right, consequentialism broadly, but then like upon reflection, you do not endorse a conclusion that would be consequentialist, and you don't think you're wrong to endorse that conclusion. So it raises the question of, okay, is that the right role that a moral theory should be playing then?
Yeah, that
it's an interesting question.
It's very interesting because I asked myself that because like I didn't even really critique like, or I guess self-reflect on like kind of what like kind of moral theory should involve. But then I'm reading this and it's like it's weird that like it's not simply a matter of like what you ought to do.
And I think in the past, like, I know this was true of me, and I've been, like, I think I've been like been chiseled away at a little bit on this, where I think in early college I was very, very dismissive of the role of like common sense or intuition or even just like empirical data about like what either I do every day or like what people do every day, right? And I definitely would have said like explicitly, I do not care. Like that is not what, like that should not be present in ethics, like ethics or philosophy in general, like honestly. And like the role of what we're doing here is like figuring out what's true and then let's import it onto our practices and see what needs to be changed, right? But like I don't know, Wolf is like again, like I'm really in the middle, and I'm still like more on the side of like, in some sense I don't care if like common people think something is wrong, right? um but I think Wolf is pointing in this essay to like, I think being more open to common sense as a being more open to common sense and like intuition and that sort of thing as like a datum. It's like not something that you should base your theory on, because then it's just like it's like almost just a purely descriptive project, like whatever we currently think is, like the moral, and then that's not interesting either. But it's like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know, Adam, like what do you think about that challenge? Yeah.
I think, I don't know. I think treating a moral theory like that is perfectly acceptable in my mind, because the reason we all kind of like consequentialism is it's pretty close to like hitting the mark on a lot of things. And at least for me, it has actually changed my perspective in a meaningful way. It hasn't just confirmed like pre-existing beliefs I've had. It's actually changed my mind significantly on like how to view different situations and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, me too.
Yeah. So like, I mean, off air, we could like name things of like, perspectives we had in the past. I mean, even something like abortion, honestly, like I'm not even sure I would have had like the opinion I do now had I not been privy to like the moral theory of consequentialism. You know what I mean? So like,
yeah,
but it's like, at the end of the day, we recognize that it's not perfect, right? Like it's a theory.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I think it's always a good starting point to kind of run things through that. But if the output from the theory is kind of just like, is so strongly in contrast to kind of like your intuitions, I think that's something to like be re-examined at that point. You know what I mean? Like it's even probably worth a paper, you know what I mean? Like of how it fails at that point. But yeah, I don't think you have to take consequentialism, to its fullest extent without recognizing that consequentialism, like that perspective, adds something meaningful to how you view morality in general and ethics in general. I mean,
yeah. So would you say, so like, do you think that you would currently fall into the camp that I said that I did, and still do to like most extents, where I'm saying like I'm sort of just like biting the bullet of like, like weakness of will, essentially, like that is the right thing to do and I'm just too weak to do it, and like most people are?
Yeah, I'd mostly agree with that. I think there are some areas where like I've heard, certain thought experiments that kind of like push up against like consequentialism, and it's like, okay, maybe it's not a perfect system of ethics, right? So I don't know. I think if you run into something like that, then you just have to recognize that you can't like, follow whatever output comes out of that framework, but you should really like, but the framework has led to some interesting perspectives in my life. So
yeah, because so I was thinking about this too, because like I'm like, my current ethical view is like a very like I would call it like again, like first year masters, so I don't know what I don't know, obviously, like, and I don't even know a lot of stuff that I do know that I don't know. But But like, so currently, like, I'm very amenable to a view that's kind of close to what Peter Railton, from Michigan, has talked about, where he calls it like sophisticated consequentialism. Um, and now you're asking me to recall something that I haven't read in like 4 years, but basically, it's like the idea that sometimes you don't have to act um, like truly on a consequentialist basis, right? In order to like, there's a way in which you can sort of like live life in a more like loosely defined way, in a way that you think will generate better consequences, or even possibly the best consequences, right? And I'm also open to like a very wide lensed view of consequences. Like,
Me too. Me too.
yes,
Yeah. Yeah. I was
yeah,
gonna say that too.
yes. So it's like, because I also have the intuition that like, there's more than just pleasure, like, because you could derive pleasure for like, I don't think it's incoherent to say like you could derive pleasure for the wrong reasons, say, you know what I mean? Like, just like a Christian, just like burning some like Hindu text or whatever. That's like a weird example, right? But they might, a crazed Christian of some sort might derive pleasure from that, right? And it's like, yeah, but I think that's the wrong kind of pleasure to derive. So like, I clearly do have like a wider ranging like view of consequences than just utility. But okay, so like this was brought up in class. Okay. So, because I was thinking about that too. But then there's a way in which like that doesn't solve everything. It solves a lot, but doesn't solve everything, because okay, so we define consequentialism as like this wide ranging project, right? Okay, so you buy the theory, you even have like a very sophisticated algorithm that's correct. Like, we're not going to assume any issues with the algorithm, right? So if you give it all of the relevant information, it will tell you the right answer, right? So that's not the issue. So you're in this dilemma, whatever it is. You input all of the information, and the answer is, okay, do X, do action X. That's within your power to do. This reminded me of Sartre again, where, okay, but you can still actually ask, should I do X or not? Like, do I do that? Like, like the thing says, okay, do X, but pretend that X goes against some other value that you have. Like, you are actually still in a position where you have to decide what to do. And like, I think Wolf's point is that it's like, at least one of her points, like, you're not going to get there is no answer to this question that's going to like close off that further question of like, what value do I act on? And there's no, I think at the end of the day, she's arguing for something like an incommensurability thesis. Like, you can't boil things down into one axis. Like,
these things do seem orthogonal. Yeah. A lot of these different kind of values.
Yeah, like, you just can't. And I was wondering, like, and the thing is, like, I don't know about you guys, but honestly, Wolf's view in this was a little bit slippery to me, where I got a really good picture of what she wasn't saying and like the reasons why she didn't believe some things. But then when I try to grab a hold of like, what's the positive thing she is saying, I can get a little bit of it, but I also have this lingering suspicion that I don't get all of it. Did
I have more than a lingering suspicion. I don't get all of it.
All right, Gavin, you give what's on your mind, because you just something, you clearly thought of something there. So
it was more of like a kind of a impression, really. Just like, I mean, I'll be frank, like, I kind of gave this like just one read, so not like the normal two. So that's kind of just like a global kind of thing.
Therefore, you're wrong.
No, I don't know. I would benefit from like reading it again, but
I mean, it certainly leaves a lot of questions open. I mean, because
it had to be more inquisitive than it did like overly like knowledgeable about her framework.
Yeah, because you finish the paper and it's like, okay, what's a better life lived? An Olympic swimmer or someone who gives their life to charity? It's like, Well, it just depends with which framework you're viewing this from.
Yeah.
I mean, from a moral perspective, yes, clearly the person who gave their life to charity is more moral, but that doesn't mean like life better spent. So, or I mean, definitely doesn't mean that, at least based on this paper. So,
yeah,
because by the end, I mean, she's not even arguing for like that morality is necessarily at the top of like the value pyramid.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's one thing that we can say for sure that she is advocating for, is that like there's not a unity of values. Like you have to be pluralistic about things. Yes.
Yeah.
I think that part's very clear.
Yeah.
This is just my idea, so it could be bunk. But I was almost thinking about it. I have a tendency to like try to put things in graphical form or whatever. Like that's just how my mind kind of gravitates towards things. What do you think about this idea? So, so she's saying like we can't reduce things to one axis, right? So that makes me think of like there's a line, there's pleasure, there's pain. Not everything can boil down to that, right? Because this goes to the paper that Adam and I read that Giffen, I didn't send this to you because we weren't doing an episode on it, but it's her paper that we did for week 1, which is like good for nothings. That's the title of it. In that paper, she defends the idea that things can be valuable without being like strictly welfare producing. So you might find like a piece of art valuable, even if it doesn't give you, just like welfareist pleasure. Right. And
her point, Giffen, is that like, she names like a, pretty famous, Northern European Renaissance painter. And she says like, if that guy had not painted, like, and you were like a fan of his work, well, you would have been a fan of somebody else's work. You know what I mean? Like you or some other, Northern European Renaissance painter, right? Like it's not that specific work that provides welfare to you. Like had that painting not been painted, you would have like derived the same pleasure and welfare from some other painting. So,
but her point is like, nonetheless, we can still say that it is valuable to be a painter, even if you're not going to. Produce that robust value of like people could have only derived pleasure if you did this painting or whatever. You know what I mean? Like people are going to get pleasure from something else, or whatever.
I totally get the pluralistic kind of framework.
But okay, so here's my idea. So she definitely is advocating. It's very clear that she's advocating for some pluralistic way of viewing things, where you can't boil like a decision down to any value, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, she's not denying that there are like very, very meaningful and like one might even say objective distinctions within like any given axis, right? So yeah. Okay. So obviously, like in the moral domain, she's not even close to denying that there are like more unethical acts and more ethical acts, right?
Yeah.
And in the the aesthetic axis, she's not denying that there's like shit art. Like if I paint a drawing, it's gonna be terrible. It's just gonna be terrible in a way that whoever that Does or whatever from the other paper, his work is going to be way better, right? Okay, so what if there's like, okay, so here's, and I'm sorry for people who are just listening, but like here's the way I was kind of thinking about it. What if there's there's concentric circles that I'm thinking about, right?
Ooh, hell.
Where where things can be like more fundamental to human life at the center of the circle. So like, I almost think like I don't want to like mention Maslow or whatever, but like almost his hierarchy of needs. So like, but that's not the whole story, because there are like multiple axes of like many, many different things that all can have more fundamental things or less fundamental things on it. So, there's like, Okay, so like you could even look at it in like terms of like rationality. Like there are like really, really basic kind of concepts or abilities that define like the bare standards of like what it means to be rational, up until people who are like, they understand things in a way in which we will never like even dream of understanding them, right? But that sense seems almost like less fundamental than like really basic senses of rationality. And it could be the same thing for different like moral virtues or whatever, right? um Gif, what do you think about this, Giffen? Like,
No, my mind wandered a bit for a second. I'm sorry. Please go on. Just go on.
just thinking about the things that you could never dream of understanding. A wry grin, as for a moment you glimpse what you could never understand.
Only for a passing moment.
I don't know. I'm just thinking like, I don't know. I almost wonder if she could preserve some sort of aspect of like fundamentality, but things still being on different axes that you still have to like, I don't know. Maybe that's me trying to boil it down too much.
I think she would resist that.
I get your point.
Yeah.
I just that definitely opens up an entire can of worms, though. I mean, it's just like where is for something like morality, like where was that line of like reaching like at least like the fundamental moral sense.
Yeah, I might resist saying like there is a line, but I'm saying like maybe some moral concepts are more fundamental, or maybe even just like, but then again,
because it almost seems like you're trying to compare things, though. You know what I mean?
Well,
like
I'm saying
you're leaving that open.
I'm saying I'm granting her the idea that you can't compare across the axes, but keeping the ability to compare within them. In a way, like, okay, you could almost imagine, like, have you seen these kind of charts where you could see like, one possible action has like a point here, a point here, a point here, a point here. You know what I mean?
No, of course.
Yeah.
But then again, like, then I'm edging dangerously close to saying like maximize the area under the curve or something like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and sort of meta framework is being applied.
I wonder if the only thing that I'm doing there is just complicating the decision process, and she's still going to be able to say like. In fact, I've now convinced myself that that's all I've done, because she could still step back and say, "Well, I just want to be more funny than like that." Or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, right? Like
that's what I mean. Like it's because you are still almost kind of comparing them if you kind of have them on like the same axis there, right? Like you're putting multiple different axes all on the same axis. That's what you're doing. So it's like
an aggregation, right?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, she has me like on the edge of my seat in a way that I hope like some of these questions get answered more, because it's weird. Like I'm very convinced without being 100% sure of what I'm convinced of in some sense.
No, that's what I kind of where I'm at. Like this definitely opened a lot of questions for myself, but like that's my takeaway is more so like, wow, there's a lot of things to think about.
Yes. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Like I said, it's definitely just, I think my main takeaway from this is like, dial down the confidence a little bit. Yeah. So, all right. Well, from Sam and Vita, the next couple readings are supposed to dive into these questions even more. So it's going to be good.
Excellent.
Yeah. All right. Well, I hope listeners enjoyed at least this episode of the series. Wolf is one of my favorite philosophers nonetheless, and so people don't enjoy it, we're still going to do the series. So with that, I hope people tune in next time. If you want to support the show in any way, you can do so simply by sharing it. I'm hoping to get this show out to more people, and so if you want to share it on Twitter or social media, that would really help me. You can also rate it on Apple Podcasts, like this video if you're watching on YouTube, or subscribe via Apple Podcasts or an RSS feed, or you can connect me with recommended guests or topics to cover. You can get in contact with me at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers, and I now have a website for my philosophy endeavors at jordanmyers.org. If you want to know a little bit more about me and my fellow co-hosts, I'm a master's student in philosophy at the University of Houston. I did my undergrad at the University of Pittsburgh, where I studied mechanical engineering and philosophy, and now that I'm back at school, I'm hoping to more closely study moral responsibility, free will, ethics, epistemology, and moral psychology. Those are topics that I was introduced to and got really interested in my undergrad work. Adam and Giffen accompanied me on this show, and Adam is one of my oldest friends. We actually met in kindergarten, and we've been interested in philosophical topics for as long as we can remember, and in a lot of ways, it's been the basis of our friendship. Adam studied chemistry and biology at Cornell, and he's especially interested in moral responsibility as well, but also law, religion, and free will. Giffen is also one of my oldest friends. We've been friends since elementary school as well. Giffen studied biology and economics at RPI, and now he works in human health research. And he's particularly interested in exploring political philosophy. With all of that information, again, I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you get in contact with me or follow my work in any way that you deem reasonable to do. So with that, thank you for listening.